Hello everyone, we are continuing with our series titled God and Pagan Kings. And in this series, it has been our attempt to show that God has often revealed himself to many powerful men of world empires in the scripture. For example, God has revealed himself to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. We discussed that in video number 1. God has revealed himself to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. We discussed that in videos number 2 and 3. And then God has revealed himself to King Cyrus of the Persian Empire. We discussed that in the previous video. And in this video, we are going to focus our attention on Daniel the prophet, Alexander the Great, and Josephus the historian. Now, Alexander the Great is from the Greek Empire, and we have references concerning him in the book of Daniel, and we're going to discuss that. This video is divided into two sections. Section 1 is going to look at the prophecies in the book of Daniel concerning Alexander the Great, and section 2 is going to focus on Josephus, the first century Jewish historian who had a few things to say about Alexander the Great. So in the first section, we are going to look at Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 11. 4 places where we have references to Alexander the Great. In chapter 2, it's only an indirect reference, but chapter 7, 8, and 11 are specific prophecies concerning him. And in section 2, we are going to talk about Josephus's mentioning a vision that was given to him by God and how he therefore treats the high priest and the other priests in Jerusalem with respect. And also we are going to look at how Alexander the Great responded to the prophecies mentioned about him in the book of Daniel when they were shown to him. So the real meat of this video comes in the second section of this video, and I would ask you to patiently listen to the entire video in order for us to understand what we are talking about. So let's begin section 1 by looking at Daniel chapter 2. Now, Daniel chapter 2 is a dream, is a vision that God gave King Nebuchadnezzar about a giant statue in the form of a human being. What God was doing was God was revealing to him the coming of many world empires after the Babylonian Empire, and God was also revealing to him as to how the kingdom of God would finally take shape on the earth and fill the entire earth. So in his vision, Nebuchadnezzar sees a statue of a human being whose head is made of gold, whose chest and arms are made of silver, whose belly and thighs are made of bronze, whose legs are made of iron, and whose feet are made of iron and clay. Now, we know from hindsight that 4 world empires were being talked about. The head of gold represented the Babylonian Empire. The chest and arms of silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The belly and thighs of the statue, made of bronze, represented the Greek Empire. The legs of iron represented the Roman Empire. And the feet of iron and clay represent the kingdoms and the nations that followed the Roman Empire. Now, in this, Alexander the Great is not directly mentioned, only an indirect mention is made of the belly and thighs of bronze, which represented the Greek Empire, and Alexander the Great was the most important king of the Greek Empire. Now, in that vision, we are told that a rock that was cut out, but not by human hands, comes and strikes at the base of the statue such that the whole statue is crushed and it becomes like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. And in Daniel chapter 2, we are told that this rock that is uncut by human hands becomes a huge mountain that fills the whole earth. And we are told the interpretation of this, that the kingdom of God would ultimately destroy all human kingdoms and the kingdom of God would cover the whole earth. So there we have the first indirect reference to Alexander the Great in Daniel chapter 2. Now we are turning our attention to Daniel chapter 7. Now Daniel chapter 7 is a parallel to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is a vision that God gave to King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 7 is a vision that God gives to prophet Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, we have this huge statue which is made of gold and silver and bronze and iron, and then there is a rock that is uncut by human hands. But in Daniel chapter 7, instead of gold and bronze and all of those kinds of metals, we have 4 beasts being shown, and each of those beasts represent the kings of these particular empires. And just so that you know that I'm not making this up, I want us to look at Daniel chapter 7 verse 17 first, where the angel of God is giving Daniel the interpretation of the 4 beasts that he has seen. We are told in verse 16 and 17, I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth, we are told. So in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel sees visions of 4 beasts, and these 4 beasts represent the early kings of each of these empires. Now, it would take us a lot of time to read through each of those beasts and how it represents kings of the Babylonian Empire or the Medo-Persian Empire or the Greek Empire. Since we don't want to take time to do that, we will directly take our attention to the passage that speaks about Alexander the Great, the 3rd beast in Daniel chapter 7. Chapter 7 verse 6, we are told, after that I looked, this is Daniel looking, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. So this is a reference to Alexander the Great. Now, leopard is one of the fastest animals living on the earth. And we know that when Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world, he was a very, very fast king, conquering kingdoms at a very fast pace. So the leopard is the animal, the beast that is chosen to represent Alexander the Great here. And on its back, we are told in that same verse, it had 4 wings, like those of a bird. It is not just a leopard, but in the vision that Daniel sees, the leopard has 4 wings like that of a bird. In other words, it again points to the speed with which Alexander the Great moved across the earth. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. And so a mention about not the kingdom itself, but about the ruler of the kingdom, especially the first ruler of the kingdom, a reference to Alexander the Great. Now, mind you, Daniel is seeing this vision during the time of the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was to be followed by the Medo-Persian Empire, which was then to be followed by the Greek Empire, as is shown in chapter 2. And so chapter 7 verse 6 making a reference concerning Alexander the Great. Now, if you continue to read chapter 7, instead of the rock that was uncut by human hands, we find a son of man being brought into the presence of the Ancient of Days, and the Son of Man is given all authority and all power and all dominion and so on. So Daniel chapter 2 speaks about the rock uncut by human hands became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. And in chapter 7 we are talking about the Son of Man, and with hindsight we know that it is a reference to Jesus Christ, who would establish his kingdom that would fill the whole earth. So we are done with Daniel chapter 2, and we are done with Daniel chapter 7, and now we move to Daniel chapter 8, where we have further prophecies, further insights about Alexander the Great. Now in Daniel chapter 8, we are talking about the clash between 2 world empires. The clash between the Greek king Alexander the Great with the Medo-Persian Empire and how that spans out. So in Daniel chapter 8, we are given a vision of 2 animals, a ram and a goat. The ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and the goat represents the Greek Empire, especially Alexander the Great. And I'm going to read some verses first about the ram, about the Medo-Persian Empire, and then about Alexander the Great and how he succeeds against the Medo-Persian Empire. So be patient with me as I read chapter 8, verses 3 and 4 first. I looked up, this is Daniel seeing a vision, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. So here is a ram with 2 horns on his head. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and towards the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. Now, just in case you think that I am interpreting it to be the Medo-Persian Empire, I'm making that up. I want us to know in chapter 8, the angel of God who gives Daniel the interpretation of all of these things tells us very, very specifically as to who the ram is. For in chapter 8, verse 20, we are told, the 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So the 2 horns represent Media and Persia, and we told that one horn is longer than the other horn, representing the domination of the Persians among the collaboration between the Medo-Persians. So the ram, we are told in verses 3 and 4, it charged towards the west and towards the north and towards the south, and no animal could stand against it. No kingdom could stand against it, and it did as it pleased. So that's the power, that's the glory of the Medo-Persian Empire. But now comes in the goat, the Alexander the Great and his Greek Empire. Verse 5, as I was thinking about this, Daniel was thinking about what he was shown concerning the ram. Suddenly, a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Now, before I begin to explain verse 5, I want us to see that the angel of God, in his interpretation to Daniel, tells us who this goat is. Look at chapter 8, verse 21. We are told, the shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. So we are told that the goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the major horn between its eyes speaks of the first Grecian king, the first important Grecian king, a reference to Alexander the Great. So as Daniel was thinking about the ram with its 2 horns, suddenly, very quickly, a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. Remember that Daniel is in Babylon when he is seeing the vision, and Greece is towards the west of Babylon, and Alexander the Great comes from the west, therefore, for Daniel, and he says that I saw a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes coming from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. In other words, the goat moved so fast over the earth that it felt like its feet were not touching the ground. Remember the reference in Daniel chapter 7 to that beast which was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird. In other words, the leopard is a fast-moving animal, and the bird's wings represent fast movement again. And so Daniel chapter 7 is also saying the same thing that Daniel chapter 8 is speaking about, how Alexander the Great would move with a fast conquest on the face of the earth. Verse 6, it came towards the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. So here you have the goat coming fast towards the ram, the 2-horned ram, the Medo-Persian Empire, and it's coming at it with a fast pace and with great rage. Verse 7, I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. So the goat comes and attacks the Medo-Persian Empire and destroys the two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. In other words, the Medo-Persian Empire was powerless against this Grecian king called Alexander the Great. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. So the Grecian Empire would conquer the Medo-Persian Empire, would trample it on the ground, and none would be able to rescue the Medo-Persian kingdom from the hands of this Grecian king. Verse 8, the goat became very great. We are talking about Alexander the Great, who became very great. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. We are told that when Alexander the Great is at his peak, he will be broken off, he will be cut off, he will be taken away from this world, and in place of this one large horn, there would be 4 prominent horns that would grow up towards the 4 winds of heaven. And if you know the Grecian history, we know that when Alexander the Great died in his early 30s, Grecian Empire was divided amongst the 4 major commanders of Alexander the Great, and they divided and they fought against themselves, and that is what is being told about here, the great horn being replaced by the 4 prominent horns. And so we have finished with Daniel chapter 2, we have finished with Daniel chapter 7, we have finished with Daniel chapter 8. Quickly, let's move our attention to Daniel chapter 11 as well, and we will read verses 2 to 4. This is again Daniel speaking. Now then, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. Now, by the time Daniel is seeing this vision, the Persian Empire has come into power. The Babylonian Empire has been displaced. And so God is telling him 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. There would be a clash between the Persian king and the Grecian kingdom. Then a mighty king will arise. This is verse 3, a reference to Alexander the Great, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. In other words, the Persian king will not be able to stand against this Grecian king, Alexander the Great. He will become powerful, and with great power, he will rule as he pleases. Verse 4, after he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out towards the 4 winds of heaven. We are told something that we were told in Daniel chapter 8 as well. When he is removed from power, 4 of his commanders would take control over his empire. And we are told in chapter 11, it will not go to his descendants. In other words, Alexander's son would not be the one to inherit the kingdom. Alexander died at the age of 33, I assume, and so his son would not be old enough to do that. So Daniel is told that the Grecian Empire will not go to the sons of Alexander, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. And from hindsight, we know how all of these were fulfilled. Now that brings us to the end of section 1, where we were looking at the prophecies by Daniel concerning Alexander the Great. And now we move to section 2, in which we are going to talk about Josephus, the 1st century historian, the Jewish historian, who writes a summary of the history of the Jews in his Antiquities of the Jews. And I'm going to take our attention to book 11, chapter 8, sections 4 and 5 in the Antiquities. And first, I want us to see how Josephus speaks about a vision that Alexander the Great had seen, which he himself speaks about. And then we will see what Alexander does when he is shown the prophecies concerning him from the book of Daniel. So let's start reading from Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. Now Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem, and Jaddua the high priest, when he heard that, was in agony and under terror, as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians. So Alexander had just conquered Gaza, and he was on his way to Jerusalem, and the high priest was very fearful as to how he should approach Alexander the Great, how he should interact with him. And when he understood that he was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. So when Jaddua the high priest in Jerusalem hears that Alexander the Great is close to the city of Jerusalem, he takes out a procession of the priests and a multitude of citizens. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priests stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre upon his head, having the golden plate whereon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name and first saluted the high priest. So here we have the high priest in his clothing, all the priests in their linen clothing, and when Alexander the Great sees this procession, he approaches the procession all by himself, and he adores the name that is written on the golden plate that is on the high priest, and he also salutes the high priest. That's very interesting, is it not? That Alexander the Great would salute the high priest and would honor the name of the God that is written on the golden plate. The Jews also did altogether with one voice salute Alexander and encompass about him. The Jews were very happy seeing the approach of Alexander the Great and the respect that he is paying them, and so they gather around Alexander the Great. Whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done and supposed him disordered in his mind. The Syrian kings, probably those that Alexander had already captured, were with Alexander the Great, and they thought that he had gone crazy. Why would he honor a Jewish high priest in the way that he is honoring him? However, Parmenio alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. So Alexander the Great was asked this question: Lord, everybody else adores you. How come you are adoring the high priest? Now listen to this very interesting response that Alexander the Great gives. To whom he replied, I did not adore him, the high priest, but that God who hath honored him with his high priesthood. In other words, I'm not honoring the high priest, but I'm honoring the God who has appointed him as the high priest. For, he tells him the reason for that, I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, in this very clothing, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army, and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that, having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it, and remembering that vision and the exhortation which I had in my dream. So Alexander the Great is explaining why he is honoring the God of this high priest. He says, even before I started all these world conquests, when I was in Macedonia and I was thinking about conquering other kingdoms, I saw this very man in this very clothing appear to me in a vision, and God spoke to me through this man, and God said that he would give me control over the Medo-Persian Empire, and that he would conduct my army, and that he would give me dominion over the kingdoms, over the Persians. And I have never seen that man that I saw in the vision with that kind of clothing. But when I see the high priest now, I remember my vision that I saw years ago, and it was this very man in this very clothing. And when he went up into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. So Alexander the Great goes into the temple of Jerusalem and offers a sacrifice to the Lord there, according to the instructions that is given to him by the high priest and the other priests, and thus he honors the God of Israel in the temple at Jerusalem. Now listen to something very, very interesting. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. So the Jewish leadership at Jerusalem brought to Alexander the Great the book of Daniel and showed him, probably from chapter 8 or from chapter 11, how God had told that the Medo-Persian Empire, in chapter 8 it is the ram, that would be destroyed by a Greek king, which is the goat, and how the goat would win victory over the ram. Or in chapter 11 we are told about how the final Persian king would attack the kingdom of Greece, or would want to fight against the kingdom of Greece and would be defeated. When Daniel is shown these passages from, I believe, chapter 7, chapter 8, and from chapter 11, he was greatly surprised, and he believed that this goat that is being talked about in Daniel chapter 8, or the leopard that is spoken about in chapter 7, is he himself. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present, but the next day he called to them and bid them ask what favors they pleased of him. So he's calling these people, the Jewish leadership, to him, and he asks, how should I show favor to you? How should I bless you people? Whereupon the high priest desired that they may enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. And so they ask him so that the Jews could follow the law of Moses for themselves, that they would not be governed by the laws of the Persian Empire or now the Greek Empire. He granted all they desired, and when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. So they got bold enough to ask whether the Jews in other regions as well could live by the law of Moses. Alexander the Great was so pleased with these people that he granted them their request. And so the Jews were treated with great respect. Now, the questions that arise in our minds are, why would Alexander the Great treat the Jewish people with such compassion and with such respect? And I think there are two reasons to this. Number one, the vision that he saw even before he started all his conquests. When he saw the high priest with all his garments in all his colors, and he saw the priests dressed in white, in linen, and the word that was told to him, which came true during his lifetime. And then he is also shown, number two, the prophecies from the book of Daniel, which ultimately then convinced him that these prophecies were concerning him, and therefore he treats the high priest with respect, he treats the priests in Jerusalem with respect, and he grants all the requests that the Jews have placed before him. What are we trying to talk about? We are trying to talk about God revealing himself to the pagan kings. This is the last video in the series, and so I want us to see how God revealed himself to Pharaoh in the Egyptian empire repeatedly by showing him that his gods are not gods, that God of Israel is the true and the living God. Similarly, King Nebuchadnezzar knew about the prophecies that were made about him from Jeremiah, and therefore treats Jeremiah with respect. And again, God reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar. God reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar again in the book of Daniel by giving him dreams, by giving him visions. And in chapter 3, the Son of Man appears to King Nebuchadnezzar in that fire in which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were put in. If you have not listened to these videos, I would ask you to go back to these videos in the series and listen to them. We talked in another video of how God revealed himself to Cyrus, king of Persia, initially through prophet Isaiah, and then that was brought to his attention, Josephus tells us in his Antiquities. And in this video, we look at how prophet Daniel is prophesying indirectly about Alexander the Great in chapter 2 and directly about him in chapters 7, 8, and 11, and how God revealed himself to Alexander the Great in a vision and then brought to his attention these passages from the book of Daniel. What a fascinating series this has been, where God takes the extra effort to reveal himself to the kings that are around the people of God, and thus God seeking to announce himself as God, and God trying to attract these people towards himself. Whether they responded positively or not is a different question, but the fact that God revealed himself to them is what I wanted to show from the biblical scriptures. And with that, we close with this video and also the series, God and Pagan Kings. I believe that there are other cases to be made as well. For example, Paul speaking about God to the Roman rulers at different instances in the book of Acts, but that's not for now. We are closing the series called God and Pagan Kings. I believe this was a blessing to you. We will come back with another series. Until then, God's presence be with all of us.